Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the third installment of the Boston University's Road to Washington discussion. This is part of a series that was put together by the College of Arts and Sciences and by the College of Communication, and it's intended to provide insight into the election this year. I think what we have hoped our contribution would be to add a little bit more light and a little less heat than what you otherwise might see. So we've assembled a group of, I actually think, some very distinguished and knowledgeable people here to talk about what we're going to do today. In previous Road to Washington programs, we talked a good bit about the primary process and what was going on there, the fights leading up to the nomination. And I think what we've finally found now, well into the process, several months after this whole scrum started in Iowa, is that we're at the point where it's clear the candidates of both parties, obviously the incumbent, President Obama, no question on that side, but finally there is clarity on the Republican side, at least as to the top of the ticket with Mitt Romney. As he emerged yesterday, was it yesterday or 2 days ago, when finally Newt Gingrich realized which way the wind was blowing after it had knocked him over, and able to move forward, where Mitt Romney clearly now will go with the go toward the nomination. And I have to, I guess, in full disclosure, say this completely destroyed my prediction earlier that this would end up in a brokered convention this year, which I think others on the panel at that time told me was foolish. I am Tom Fiedler. I'm the Dean of the College of Communication. Perhaps more relevant to this, I'm a former journalist. I spent 36 years as a reporter, 25 of those as a political writer. I covered 7 presidential campaigns between 1972 and 1998, and covered the White House during a stint there. So my susceptibility, I guess, to the political bug is long enduring, and so I'm delighted to be a part of this panel. Our conversation today, as it has been, is being streamed live through the Alumni Association's Ustream page. So a warm welcome to any of you who are listening or viewing from across the country or outside of the metro area here, or maybe even across the world. We're delighted to have you. And if you would like to participate in the discussion via Ustream, you can simply share your question on the page's wall, as the page is being monitored by people here, and the questions will be relayed to our panelists. And now I'd like to welcome our panelists here. Again, it's a distinguished group. Immediately to my right is my colleague, Virginia Sapiro. She's the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, but again, more relevant to the program today, she is also a political scientist, and a distinguished one at that. She's had for several decades, are we allowed to say decades? Does that date you too much? For several decades, she has been analyzing public opinion and political communication and political leadership. She is truly considered one of the nation's experts on gender and politics, and she is also a director of the American National Election Studies, which those of you who follow this know this is the source, the foundation, the benchmark of political polling and surveying since 1948, I believe, for a long time. So she's been, well, no. And she's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So we're delighted to have Dean Sapiro. To her right is Professor Andrew Bacevich. I also would address him as Colonel Bacevich. He is a member of the Department of International Relations in the College of Arts and Sciences. His specialty is American diplomatic and military history. He's a graduate of West Point and has his master's and PhD from Princeton in that field of diplomatic and military history. He's also a many times published author of some significant and thoughtful books in that area, including Washington Rules, The America's Path to Permanent War, which was published last year, and he's a frequent contributor to the op-ed pages of some of our most distinguished newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and certainly the Boston Globe. So we're delighted to have Professor Bacevich here with us today, as that's going to be an area of discussion. To his right is Professor Graham Wilson. Dr. Wilson is a professor, and he's the chairman of the Department of Political Science in the College of Arts and Sciences. His specialty, this may throw you off when you hear him speak and hear his accent, but his specialty is American politics and business and government. Dr. Wilson has also published many books, 9 books, and again, frequently authors articles and volumes on politics. His primary focus has been the impact of interest groups and typically business groups on the political process here. And on the far right, on my far right, on your left, is Professor Wesley Yin. He's an assistant professor in the economics department in the College of Arts and Sciences, faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He came to Boston University from Harvard, where he was the Robert Wood Johnson Scholar in Health Policy, and he's also been previously at the University of Chicago, the Harris School of Public Policy. Again, relevant to the issues facing us in this campaign. His current research is in the areas of health, economic development, and public finance. And his current research is the interaction between the public and private sector in the health insurance market. So I think we can learn much from what he has to offer. So what I'm going to do, I'll ask the panelists to open up and perhaps speak for a few minutes about the particular topic that they will focus on, and then we want at some point to open this up to your questions so that we can have what I would hope would be kind of a lively and informative interchange. So with that, Dean Shapiro.
Thank you. Let me start briefly with my dean's hat on and say that it's really been fun and a privilege to work with my colleague from COM this year, a really good example of some of what we do at Boston University, to have the College of Communication and the College of Arts and Sciences working together, because the knowledge we need about topics like this requires the faculty and expertise from both our schools. So this is, as I say, a pleasure, it's fun, and it's also a very important indication of what we do at BU. Now, turning and putting my other hat on, the one I had for, as you said, decades. What I'm here to talk about for a few minutes is issues of gender and so-called women's issues in the election this year. One of the things that is perennial for those of us who are scholars who know something about gender politics is during any given election, what kind of immensely silly things happen. And we've seen a lot of them. As soon as somebody starts talking about women's issues, and perhaps are the candidates addressing women's issues well enough, or are they insulting women, or as some people have said this year, is there a war on women? The male candidates immediately respond in the most intellectual, serious, and political way possible. They walk up to their wives, put their arms around them, put on a stupid grin, and say, "My wife is really my boss," and then they hang on to them for dear life, thinking that that is somehow going to influence women across the country positively. And after all these years, they haven't figured out that really doesn't cut ice. To the contrary, they really do look silly. So I want to talk about gender and politics briefly in 2 different ways. One is, what difference does gender make in the way people vote? That is the whole question of the gender gap, and do men and women respond differently? Do they vote differently? And what's this business about the gender gap that tends to lead women to vote more Democratic than men? And the second is, what do we make about of this notion of women's issues? Do men and women care about different issues differently? Do they really think about politics differently? Because certainly we hear those assertions all the time. So first of all, on the gender differences, this year, as we've seen fairly consistently since roughly 1980 in the United States, when we look at polls on the presidential election, we are finding consistently that women tend to be somewhat more favorable of the Democratic candidate than men are. Men tend to be somewhat more favorable toward the Republican candidate than women are. Why does that happen, and is it consistent? I think what's very important to know is that the way to go about interpreting this isn't to ask what's up with women, because a gap is created by both parties. So what's up with women and what's up with men? What is different here? It's important to note that the difference between men and women in their support of the parties is not consistent over elections. In different presidential elections, sometimes it's been larger, sometimes it's been smaller. It is not consistent across offices. That is, sometimes it's really big in the presidential race, but small in some of the Senate races, or even larger in the congressional races. And also, if you go from country to country, you'll find there are some countries where there's no gender difference at all. You'll find somewhere, as here, the women tend to be a little bit more liberal or left, and somewhere, as it used to be back in the 1950s and before then, the women are a little bit more conservative or right. So all of that tells you, because history, time, and place make a difference, this isn't biological. This is something social. In a nutshell, where did this gap come from in the U.S.? It first really appeared in 1980, but it developed in the 1960s and the 1970s. The short story has to do with some fundamental changes that happened in the American electorate. And it was as something very big began to happen, and the Democratic Party, which was very strongly the majority party in this country from the New Deal, from the late 1930s, 38, somewhere around there, the Democrats were strongly in the majority and then began to lose that majority in the 1960s and certainly the 1970s. What happened at that point was, as certain constituencies went away from the Democratic Party, that happened more among men than women. That's where the gender gap really began. A couple of issues in particular, and I can elaborate on this later, but a couple of the issues that really pushed the drain of the Democratic Party and also created the gender gap had to do with a couple of things. One was race politics, and one was the politics around poverty and social support. And so the argument that was made, particularly in the 1980 election by Ronald Reagan, that said the problem with the economy was that the government was too interventionist, that they were hiring the wrong people, that affirmative action meant the people who weren't qualified, like blacks and women and so forth, were getting more of the jobs. That was convincing to a certain portion of what had previously been in the Democratic Party, and among those, it was more convincing to the male base than the female base. But everything else has to do what happens in particular elections. So that gender gap has ranged from not very big at all, just a couple of percentage points, to where it is at the moment, 18, 19 percentage points. Who knows where it will be in November. So that's the gender difference. We're seeing it. We're seeing it in some of the Senate and House races. Doesn't mean it's going to remain stable. If the economy jolts badly, if some other issues happen, a few bad gaffes here, a few who knows what's over there, that difference in male and female reaction to Obama and Romney, the Democrats, the Republicans, and all the other coattails out there, that difference can change. Let me then turn briefly to this question of the kind of issues and what it is in particular men and women notice in elections. If issues drive, what issues drive them and what drives them differently? Do they see different things as important? Even if they see an issue as equally important, do they have different views? And there are a lot of folks who don't look at the research, who have the feeling that men and women are, Mars and Venus and all that. All the differences I'm about to talk about are really small. So even where we find differences, there are not massive differences between men and women in how they view the elections. We know it's not a matter of whether candidates put their arms around people. There's a really interesting poll. This is Pew, which does some very nice work. The Pew Research Center looked fairly recently at a whole range of issues, maybe 15, 20 issues, and asked people, which of these are most important to you? Didn't say, how do you feel about them, but just what's important. So the economy, of course, is most important to most people. Jobs, most important to most people. Healthcare, education, the budget deficit, also really important to 3/4 of the population. Of course, we differ on what we think we should do about it, but most of us think those things are important. Well, when we look at the polls, we find that men and women completely agree that the most important thing to pay attention to now is jobs in the economy. Not surprising. When you dig down, you find that some of their solutions are marginally a little different. What they want to do about jobs in the economy is a little different. Women are somewhat more likely to see the role of an activist government to assist in helping the economy and to assist in creating and protecting jobs. Not massively, but nevertheless, they think it's very important, but they think an activist government can help. Education, healthcare, on both of those, women see those issues as somewhat more important than men do, and they also have somewhat different opinions from men. Again, not huge, but in the directions you'd expect. They see more reason for intervention. They are not as opposed to some of the general policies, although Obamacare itself and the view of whether Obamacare should stand, no difference between men and women. Very interesting. The politics are very interesting. And so, later, if anybody has questions about other issues, I can talk about it. The take-home here is, in terms of priorities, it's just not true that men care about war and women care about peace, or women care about taking care of people and men care about, energy. We mostly care about the same things, but we might have a slightly different take. I guess let me close this just with one issue. Again, I'm going to go to the Pew Research Center just to show you an example of how you have to dig down really to see what these differences are. Questions about what should we do about energy. We know energy is an important issue. What do we do about energy and the environment? Pew asked a whole bunch of questions on energy, like, do you like using nuclear power? Do we want to see more oil and gas drilling? Should we instead do mass transit? And what you see is the differences between men and women depend on what questions you're asking. So men and women, no difference on whether we should go to mass transit, no difference on federal funding for alternative energy research, no difference on tax cuts for oil and gas. But there are two issues where we see a little bit of difference. Women are much less likely than men to feel that we should increase the use of nuclear power. And women are less likely than men to support the idea of more oil and gas drilling in U.S. waters. So again, can you say that we're massively different? No. It depends in a really sophisticated way on how we think about issues, priorities, and policies. Thanks.
Thank you, Gina. We had an interesting week, and President Obama flew under great security and great secrecy to Afghanistan, and it happened to be, perhaps just coincidence, maybe, the anniversary of the killing of Osama bin Laden. But it has generated, I think, a lot of focus or attention on the position that President Obama is trying to put himself in when it comes to where he stands on the scale of dove to hawk. New York Times this morning raised the question, for President Obama, the days leading up to his re-election kickoff have been spent straddling the precarious line between hawk and dove and possibly redefining his parties for years to come. So, Professor Bacevich, what do you think this means for President Obama, for the electorate, where we're going in the fall?
Well, I think the conventional wisdom is that foreign policy, or if you will, national security policy, is unlikely to play a major role in determining the outcome of the election. Americans are understandably concerned about economic issues and will support the candidate who can make the most persuasive case that he has a plan to restore prosperity. That seems to be the common expectation. And I see no reason to dissent from that conventional wisdom. Many, I suspect, maybe even most, voters have already made up their mind who they're going to vote for. Those who have not made up their minds are more likely to vote on bread and butter issues than on other concerns. So in that sense, foreign policy has, for the moment at least, slipped to the political periphery. And in that regard, I think the mood of the electorate may compare to that which existed back in 1992 when Governor Bill Clinton was challenging the incumbent George Herbert Walker Bush. So even though many Americans are unhappy with the course of foreign policy since 9/11, that unhappiness, at least up to this point, hasn't translated into any real political energy. I mean, for example, polls right now, I think, show that something on the order of 75% of the public thinks that the Afghanistan war is a mistake. And yet the war continues with little notice, frankly, and certainly next to no protest. I personally regret this, and I would be happy to see the electorate up in arms in response to the gross misjudgments of the past decade, but my regret is utterly irrelevant. Among the foreign policy issues are questions that ought to have a prominent place in the campaign, that we ought to hear people debating, are the following. First, obviously, the origins, costs, and consequences of that group of events that we once grouped together as the global war on terrorism. I mean, a decade into this war, which continues, what have we learned, if anything, as a consequence of all that has occurred? Secondly, I think we should be hearing some debate over the likely implications of the so-called Arab Spring, to include the prospective emergence of Islamist regimes in very important countries like Egypt. Third, it would be nice if we could hear people discuss the implications of the demise of the so-called peace process, with a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict now looking increasingly remote. Fourth, I'd like to hear people talk about the challenges posed by a nuclear-armed, increasingly unstable Pakistan, a putative U.S. ally with which the United States shares virtually no common interest whatsoever. Fifth, it would be nice if we could hear some discussion about the implications of the passing of the very brief era of post-Cold War unipolarity and the challenges in managing what will in all likelihood become a new multipolar order that will include China and India among powers of the first rank. Last time we had a multipolar order, the collapse that began in 1914 took decades to resolve itself, resulted in the deaths of countless millions of people. It would be nice if we could not repeat that experience in the 21st century. Sixth, it'd be nice if we could hear some serious discussion about how the United States might contribute to orchestrating a response to global warming in ways that could, on the one hand, reduce damage to the environment, and on the other hand, preserve at least the possibility for people here and abroad enjoying some decent standard of living. That we will hear little on these matters, apart from posturing, usually intended to make a candidate, allow a candidate to look like a tough guy, that we will hear so little, I think, is a sad commentary on our politics. And tough guy posturing will tend to focus on near-term issues like the supposed nuclear program in Iran, or even in the present moment, the fate of a single Chinese dissident, rather than on the long-term, larger issues. All of that said, I am conscious of how the mood of the moment can be overturned in a millisecond. The events of the past couple of decades testify eloquently to our inability to anticipate events. To put it another way, we are constantly getting caught by surprise. For all the money that we lavish on the national security apparatus, Washington in particular has demonstrated a knack for getting caught with its pants down. Think about it. 9/11 itself, the aftermath of invading Iraq, the Great Recession, the Arab Spring, maybe throw in the BP oil spill, the list goes on. Each and every time, events caught the state napping. Should another suitably large, bad news event coming out of nowhere occur during the next few months, then an election in which foreign policy figures as an afterthought could suddenly become an election that turns on foreign policy. In short, we should not be surprised if events beyond our borders end up catching us by surprise. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we're also seeing, you mentioned the Pew poll. I think Quinnipiac came out with a poll just yesterday in which it showed in at least 3 of the key battleground states, Ohio, Florida, and Pennsylvania, The race is drawing very, very tight, reflects the national, certainly the national polling. I believe the spread in Florida is now Romney up by 1 point. In Ohio, Obama is up by 3 points, and in Pennsylvania, Obama's up by 6. But all of those are really just on the edge. So, but we have new factors in this election with the unlimited spending by the so-called super PACs, and I don't know if that's something that you were going to address at all, Dr. Wilson, but certainly the impact of outside spending on what that might do to this election would be interesting, as well as the economy and so forth. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I was going to talk about three different things, but I hope there is some connection between these points. The first is just a sort of milepost reading on the road to Washington, where I think we are. Second, I wanted to broaden out my comments on that to a more general point about public opinion. And third, I want to be highly speculative about where that leads us in terms of the governance of the country in the future. So first, for the milepost. I guess that the most obvious thing to start with is the point that Dean Fiedler has made, which is that things look incredibly close. The tracking polls say that it's 50-50, or to be more precise, 46-46. And I'll come back to that sort of 46-46 figure again in a moment. If I was in the Romney campaign, I think I would be feeling mildly optimistic at present. It seems to me that the reason why things are so close is that fundamentally the economy is not responding rapidly. Most of the signs seem to be that it's improving slowly, but at a speed that will not bring down the unemployment rate to a politically safe level in time for November. Consumer sentiment has improved considerably since, of course, 2009, but consumer sentiment still looks low by the standards of what you would hope for as an incumbent president seeking re-election. So the economic fundamentals, if you like, remain a problem for President Obama. Finally, the primary process is over. The gnats who'd been buzzing around Romney's ear have finally gone away. I was looking at the television last night, and somebody called Newt Gingrich appeared and said that he was no longer running for president. And I thought, oh, yes, I remember Newt Gingrich. But in any case, he said it's officially over now, and so that leaves Romney open to trying the Etch-a-Sketch strategy, as one of his staff unwisely, honestly called it, of redefining Romney for the general election campaign. Now the primaries are over. Of course, leaving open the danger, which we'll come back to in a moment, which is that Romney will go down as the candidate who put the flop in flip-flop. But in any case, the opportunity is there to reposition for the election campaign. The money is starting to flood in. In contrast, President Obama has seen some of his support, particularly from Wall Street in 2008, drying up. And some of the obvious opportunities have already passed. You can kill Osama bin Laden on only a limited number of occasions, and those occasions have perhaps now passed. So I think if I was Romney, I would be feeling cautiously optimistic at this point. Perhaps throw in one other thing that we may be discussing later. I have it on highest authority, which is to say my colleagues from the BU Law School, that what I might be tempted to call Republican majority on the Supreme Court will strike down at least the mandate, if not the whole healthcare law. And given the to me, somewhat puzzling unpopularity of that law, it's hard for me to see how the striking down of that law can be anything other than a negative for the president. Now, I talked about the tracking polls being 50-50, or more precisely 46-46, but what impresses me even more is that on issue after issue, you look at the opinion polls on how people feel about public policy problems, and you get the same sort of division. Gay marriage, very similar division. A rather dubiously phrased question from Pew on balancing gun rights, a phrase I didn't particularly think was wise in opinion polling, against protecting public safety. Again, a sort of 46-46 sort of division. environmental problems. How seriously should we be worried about global warming? On this too, a sort of 46-46 division of public opinion. And of course, to revert to the first point, a similarly sort of close evaluation of how good a job the president is doing, this time with the balance being somewhat slightly against the president, although it moves around a little bit. So what strikes me is that on issue after issue, we have this division of public opinion, pro and con, broadly liberal and conservative. And we don't know for sure that the same people are liberal and conservative on the same issues, but you sure think that there is a lot of correspondence. And we have, in short, as many people have remarked, imported into our country a parliamentary system without parliamentary institutions, that this sort of fundamental difference of opinion between two camps was something that was familiar to the British in the past, in the 1950s, in the 1960s, when they had a two-party system. They really don't have a two-party system any longer. But that sort of division of opinion into two camps was something which other countries have lived with in the past. It's something with which we are less familiar. And as we look beyond November, the question that intrigues me is how are the politics of all of this going to work out as we confront the significant issues which Professor Bacevich has so ably outlined in connection with foreign policy, which confront the country. And of course, that begs the question, what is the relationship between elections and underlying problems? And quite often the answer is not very much. A lot of commentators, including, for example, The Economist, have said about the current French election that this is a really frivolous exercise. The candidates are not addressing the fundamental problems that confront France. So this is not a peculiarly American problem as to whether you can have an election campaign without talking about the underlying issues. You can also have elections in which you don't really talk about what you think are the major solutions. It is, of course, celebrated in American history that in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt did not give a clear indication that he was about to undertake the New Deal. Indeed, some of his most famous speeches in the 32 campaign stressed the importance of balancing the budget. So the relationship between fundamental problems and elections is always uncertain. But nonetheless, we do think that maybe there should be some connection. There's also another issue, which is how pressing are the problems upon us? I know that many people on the right have suggested that the problem of climate change is really not that severe, that we've got plenty of time to worry about it in the future if necessary, and maybe the science isn't that precise. Similarly, I sometimes wonder if the problem of the debt is quite as pressing as most people have said. We seem very able to borrow money. The other places to put your money in the world seem less and less attractive. I'm thinking particularly of Europe. And one person suggested that if you can borrow money as cheaply as the United States can at present, if you were a business, you'd be going out and borrowing like crazy because you're paying an interest rate which is below the rate of inflation. So you're gaining in real terms. But nonetheless, casting aside such skepticism and saying that we do have real problems to confront, how can a nation that is not only 46-46 in the presidential vote, but 46-46 on so many of the public policy problems confronting us, resolve them? Particularly given our institutions, which are not geared towards giving one side or the other a clear win and a decisive mandate to govern. In the past, political science has said, no problem. Divided government works. That in the past, the sharing of power between not only different institutions, but different parties has resulted in good policy outcomes. One of the best revisions of our tax laws, sweeping away many loopholes, came in 1986 when power was divided between President Reagan and a Democratic-dominated Congress. So, Divided We Govern is the title of a very famous book. On the other hand, one has to express some skepticism. That way in which divided government worked was a way in which more conservative Democrats could provide a crucial margin for the Republicans or for the other Democrats. We have now seen the parties clarify their position, just as I think the country as a whole has, so it is more consistently Democrats versus Republicans. To draw on the history of the 1950s, when the Southern Democrats were so powerful and were essentially a third party in Congress, and say, look, divided government works, is, I think, overly optimistic. And so I think that the question, rather than the statement on which I want to end, is that in this situation where the presidential race seems tight, where the public seems so evenly divided on so many different issues, the problem confronting the nation after November is, I think, going to be how do we address the problems that most of the time, most of the people think need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. I think our next panelist can hopefully educate us all, and there are few, if any, problems that are more significant to us, the underlying problems that you refer to, than health care, or specifically what should be our nation's policy in dealing with these issues. So Dr. Yin is going to, are you going to do the presentation here? So again, in the spirit of shedding light instead of heat, Dr. Yin is going to do a presentation, and then we'll regroup and open up to your question.
So I was asked to speak about healthcare in the road to Washington. And with healthcare, the narrative that stands out the most to me really is this tension between good policies versus politics. And I think that's been highlighted quite a bit in the discussions that we've just had. And right now, I don't think anything highlights this tension more intensely than the debate surrounding healthcare reform, in particular the Affordable Care Act. For those of you who are against the Affordable Care Act, that's also called Obamacare. It carries that pejorative meaning. And right now, the right has basically uniformly denounced it as some socialist infringement upon the civil liberties of Americans, with basically no redeeming benefits. So the story of the Affordable Care Act actually starts right here in Massachusetts. With the signing of, in 2006, for Romney, which is a day that will probably live in infamy. So how is it that this Republican candidate would sign in such an infringement on civil liberties, given that there's this mandate? Clearly, there must be socialist architects prodding him with cattle prods, coercing him to sign this thing. But why are they so happy, right? And indeed, there's delight here, and how is it that's happening? Oh, clearly, there's these socialist architects here, right? So we have State Senator Travellini, we have Ted Kennedy, and Speaker Salvador de Masi. But who's this fine gentleman here on the left? Yes, Robert Moffett from the Heritage Foundation, one of the bastions of conservative economic policies, right? And at the signing, it was very clear that this was a victory of the right, given the enormous role that the private sector played in distributing and administering health care and health insurance. And Robert Moffett isn't the only person whose views were largely in favor of the Massachusetts healthcare reform, right? This is Stuart Butler, distinguished fellow director, Center for Policy Innovation, and one of the intellectual leaders at the Heritage Foundation, and this is in '89, and as well as throughout the early '90s, during the most recent wave of healthcare reform debates in the U.S., saying that mandates should apply to all households, they should buy insurance, it's the responsibility of individuals, not businesses, and it would end the free rider issue that places burden on society because we obligate ourselves to pay for the healthcare of people who don't have insurance, okay? So this is before the Affordable Care Act. What happened after the Affordable Care Act? A beleaguered Stuart Butler. And make no mistake, the Heritage and I actively opposed the individual mandate. Changing one, and then in a very delicate line towing, he says changing one's mind about the best policies but not one's principles is part of being a good researcher. Indeed, he's a very well-respected scholar, But he's placed in this very difficult situation of having to contradict himself. But why? Clearly for political reasons. He is not alone in this. Going back to the differences between sound policies versus politics, President Obama himself, during his election campaign prior to winning in 2008, in the primaries against Hillary Rodham Clinton, was against the mandate precisely because of his opponent was for the mandate. So he wanted to make this distinction. And as we see, Newt Gingrich, the Heritage Foundation, and Mitt Romney himself, both at some point have either implemented a policy that included a mandate in private sector reform, but at some point after Obama's Affordable Care Act have now gone against it, again to distinguish themselves from the incumbent. And obviously Mitt Romney has the particularly difficult task of distinguishing not only himself from Obama, but himself from himself in 2006. And the one thing that you notice here, when it comes to policy recommendations rather than politics, we have a fairly uniform agreement that a mandate is somehow beneficial, right? And there's clear economic reasons why that is, although these economic reasons aren't really brought out because, in honesty, it's actually fairly complex. And if you don't have a PhD in economics, you borrow a person with a PhD in economics to advise you on these things, because there's these issues of adverse selection, risk pooling, market stability. And these issues are quite complex, but mandates actually address many of these things. So when you actually look at the debates about policies versus politics, what we see is that there's a lot of politics here, both for and against the mandate. Not only the mandate, but whether or not we use the government to increase insurance coverage versus the private sector, whether or not you have a government option included with the private insurers, which was debated quite intensively prior to the passage of the Affordable Care Act in the House of Representatives. Whether or not there's a mandate, whether there's premium subsidies for the poor, the politics come out in full force, right? So in favor, the left can say certain things, the right can say certain things. When you go against, right, the left has certain criticisms and the right have certain criticisms. And what gets played out tends to be, right, what's politically expedient here. And we lose sight of not what's politically important, but what's important from a policy perspective. And these are the same dimensions of the reform. And these are the issues that we really care about with respect to those dimensions. It's not whether private insurers are involved, it's whether it's efficient in delivering health care. Whether it's a government option is really an issue about how that affects in the market dynamics of the private insurers. The mandate issue, likewise with the premium subsidies, these are the real issues at play, but they get played down partly because the complexity involved in this thing, right, which highlights one thing here, going back to this slide here. Why is it that there's this about face? Well, we can say it's just for political reasons, and that's fine, right? But it's not just talk, because this political opposition may actually do away with a law that's implemented, a law that extends coverage to more people, a law that gives coverage to young people to stay underneath their parents' plans, that guarantees issue if you're sick, and it guarantees that insurers won't kick you off of an insurance plan if you're sick. There's a real policy here that may get dismantled, not for any policy reasons, but for purely political reasons. And that's something that is playing out before us. And that really is the political context that we're in right now. So I actually had a few more slides about the Supreme Court rulings right now, but given the time, perhaps we'll just leave that for Q&A coming up. Thank you.
We'll open this up for questions. We have a microphone or two microphones that'll come around, and I would urge that that every sentence end with a question, and that we try to keep it focused on these topics, and perhaps direct it to a particular panelist, and we'll go from there. So,
and we'll try to keep it short.
We'll try. Yes, right. We do have a tight time frame, so.
Professor Yin, there was a Harvard epidemiological study that showed that 40,000 additional deaths per year were associated with simply lack of health insurance. But I haven't seen that presented very often as a talking point in support of that. Is that because economists found some fault with it, or was there some other reason it it hasn't been discussed that much?
Well, I think there's some clear benefits of having a lot of people covered. And I don't think that's what's being debated right now. I think it's the means through which coverage happens. And the mandate really has become so politicized, separate from its benefits to people. And I agree that those types of benefits could be played up more. But it's just so overwhelmingly being dominated by issues of federalism that those benefits are being obscured. I agree.
Here in front.
I have several questions, but I'll just ask one to start. The president has much more direct over foreign policy issues than he has over the how he may influence the economic recovery. So shouldn't the campaign be more focused on what the president can actually affect rather than what he has very little influence over?
You want to answer that, Andy?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with the premise. I mean, it's certainly, I do agree that in the realm of foreign policy, the president's prerogatives are broader than they are in domestic policy. But it doesn't follow that somehow by using these prerogatives, exercising them, the world is fixable. I mean, one of the things that strikes me more and more is the complexity of the world, the difficulty of quite understanding those trends that matter, and therefore the enormous difficulty of actually constituting something that looks like a coherent strategy. I'm about 2 inches shy of concluding that strategy actually is utterly a fiction, that policy in the realm of international relations really is a matter of responding to events, and then once you get past the event, you write up a document that makes it look like you actually knew what was going on, and that your strategy or your actions reflect some coherent or principled approach. So I'm just skeptical that the president can do all that much to fix the problems that confront the world.
Perhaps I could just throw in a quick comment. The trend in the study of the presidency has been to emphasize more the power of the president to act directly, for example, through executive orders. Back in the 60s, a very famous book emphasized the idea that the power of the president was the power to persuade, that you had to move other people to get anything done. Some people more recently, like William Howell, have emphasized more the capacity in domestic policy to change things through executive action and executive orders. Whether the world responds to those orders is a different matter. And you may have seen a story in the New York Times recently that the administration has been moving to stress much more the executive power of the president. Whether or not that could be broadened to a realization in the president's inner circle that the original presidential style, leadership style of Obama didn't work too well, what many people have characterized as a tendency to let other people get out front and lead a little bit, I don't mean this pejoratively, from behind or in cooperation with other people, is an interesting matter to speculate about.
Let me just one more sort of brief comment to try to illustrate what I mean. I mean, this drama that's unfolding in China now is absolutely fascinating. I mean, I think the president's view is that somehow we need to extricate ourselves from the global war on terror, as his predecessor called it, and then recognizing some of the trends that I alluded to in my presentation, we're going to make this pivot toward Asia, the pivot towards Asia. That's the way it's marketed. And one could imagine that this visit by Secretary Clinton to China was supposed to go some distance towards implementing that pivot. And lo and behold, the whole thing gets hijacked by this dissident. And the President of the United States may be the most powerful man in the world, but he sure couldn't anticipate that. And he's hard-pressed to come up with some kind of a response to this little miniature crisis that is going to enable him to follow through on what his administration advertised as a grand plan.
Well, and complicating that pivot, if Israel decides that it in fact does need to somehow attack Iran for its nuclear weapons development, how do you see that unfolding? Talk about hijacking an election.
Well, I have to say I'm in the camp that doesn't think that's going to happen. I think that for multiple reasons, the Israelis are unlikely to act, and I say that recognizing that Israel has this tradition of risk-taking, extreme risk-taking, when the government of Israel views a large security threat coming around the corner. But I don't think it's going to happen because, number one, this is something I suggest Obama is signaling rather clearly that he would not favor. And the government of Israel, I think, has to be very conscious at this stage of the game about taking an action that can put in jeopardy the U.S.-Israeli strategic relationship. A military action by Israel directed against Iran that somehow causes Iranian action directed against us would not be helpful in terms of perpetuating that strategic relationship. We also got the fact that security professionals on both sides, the Israeli side and the American side, have both indicated that they think this is a dumb idea. And they think it's a dumb idea, I think, in part because operationally it poses an enormous challenge. This is not like attacking the Iraqi reactor, six F-16s, one strike, reactors hit, problem solved. The Iranian program would appear to be, as best we can tell, far more comprehensive, complicated, dug in the ground, and would pose a major challenge even for the United States to take out. So I honestly don't think it's going to happen, but we'll see.
I want to ask Dean Shapiro about the one thing we didn't touch on here that is looming in front of Mitt Romney would be his choice of a running mate. How do you see him addressing that choice with the recognition that the gender gap does seem to be real? Do you think he would go toward a female running mate, or did the Republican Party get over that in the last election?
Sorry. Kelly Ayotte may be sitting by the phone hoping he's doing that. But, if his advisors have read the studies carefully, they'll tell him in the end it really doesn't matter. It's not going to it certainly won't make a difference for the gender vote. Just simply won't. It's not even clear that region makes difference, which means that Kelly Ayotte might as well just go out shopping because she's in the wrong region. I think most of the systematic research shows that there are very rare times and only very, very specific areas where vice presidential candidates will make a difference. So I think it'll have a lot more to do with who they hope will be president in the future than any other real balance that might have a major impact.
Mm-hmm. Do we have a question here?
Agreeing with the premise that we've got a 46-46 on a lot of the issues and on the presidential vote itself. Particularly you, Tom, could you address the leftovers? And if they haven't decided yet, how much of this is going to be a likability factor on the day of voting?
I guess I'll get in there. The 46-46 doesn't indicate that 46 times 2 is the sum of the people who really know what they're doing and they're going to do what they're saying they're doing, and the others are undecided. We have every reason to believe this is a very shallow, turbulent election. We have every reason to believe that turnout is going to make all the difference in the world. And so at a close election like this, and where, the issues are very close and so forth, people are flipping around all the time. A very large portion of the election are actually independents, and independents follow the winds. We have a historical tradition in this country where people say proudly, we have a lot of independents and they judge the person, not the party, and all that. Every bit of research shows that the majority of independents are people who do not pay as much of attention to politics. They don't know as much about politics, and they go with the winds, and they'll go with whatever kind of jolts there are to the economy. So 46-46 means a lot of stuff could happen.
You mentioned, though, that turnout being critical, which I think is absolutely right, and a lot of turnout depends on the passion of those voters who typically would be in one camp or another. And I want to throw this to Dr. Yin about it, because given the health care, that whole issue about how Romney explains Romney today versus Romney in '06 was the heart of the campaign, or the challenge from Rick Santorum. And that was the argument Rick Santorum made as to why Republicans should not pick Romney, because he then couldn't use Obamacare, to use his phrase, as a weapon against the president. So what do you see? Does that did in fact that issue itself disappear as something because Romney will have trouble raising that?
Well, I think this is part of the Etch-a-Sketch thing that's going to come up, which is he's not going to highlight this so much because there's not really anything to highlight given the very little distinction that the Affordable Care Act and Massachusetts reform has. So he's probably going to focus more on economic issues as opposed to healthcare policy issues, more like employment and his personal experience in the private sector in presumably job creation as opposed to destruction. But you had said earlier that if the Affordable Care Act gets stricken down by the Supreme Court, that might be a negative for Obama, and that's probably to a first order correct. There's a countervailing influence, though, which is that this might garner up a lot of intense support on the left for the dismantling of a major piece of legislation that has wide left support for. So that could play out as well if the Supreme Court comes back with a decision that strikes down the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah, there are a couple of little pieces in the Affordable Care Act that will make a difference to certain groups. People who were beginning to count on their kids having health care up to the age of 26 who will figure out that's not going to happen, and some other sorts of things like that. Now, will that make a very huge difference? Maybe not, but in a 46-46 election, we're looking at different kinds of pockets and what impact could make, critical differences here or there or the other places. So again, I think tailing on what Wes said, it's hard to know what the impact will be.
Yes, sir, and this will probably be the wrap-up question.
Who's more to blame for the shallowness of the political debate? The politicians and their advisors, or the news media for not demanding more in-depth discussions?
Or the people, and the answer is yes.
I think the answer would be yes to all of those. Although I'm going to take that quickly, and then I'll let some others jump in also. I do think that the news media becomes fascinated early on in any campaign with the horse race. And it's always who's ahead, who's not. It may be the gaffe of the day, and rather than trying to find the broader issues and focus on that. Now, having done this for much of my career and focused on the horse race, I don't think that's necessarily the wrong way to go, because I think, sad to say, and this has been touched on, typically those broader issues themselves are not what drives the electorate. The electorate tends to vote, unfortunately, I think, on whim and on prejudice and other loyalties. So there's a lot of blame to be spread around. Anybody else want to jump in and quickly, and then no? Well, I do want to say thank you for all of you coming, and we look forward to continuing this in September. Then we'll be past the conventions, and perhaps we'll have a little bit more clarity to focus on. I also want to thank those of you who listened or participated over Ustream. Thank you for picking up that conversation, and I want to once again thank the panel for taking some time to come, and again shedding whatever light we can amid all the other heat that we're apt to hear. So thanks very much, and be back again in September.